Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the AMD Ryzen Threadripper PRO 3995WX, or as I like to call it, the WEPYC, or Workstation EPYC. This is AMD's 64-core 128-thread entry into the professional workstation market. And so in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about the chip, but also talk about the platform, which is this Lenovo ThinkStation P620 that it comes in. I also wanted to talk about the performance, but then also very importantly, talk about the market impact of having a solution like this from AMD in the market. When the original AMD EPYC 7001, codenamed Naples series, launched, I asked the AMD server guys, I said, hey, I am using a dual Xeon E5 V4 system as my main workstation. Can maybe you guys turn these EPYC processors into a workstation processor so that way I could use that instead? Now, I think due to just market segmentation and sizing, the AMD server team's like, oh, that's great that you want that, but we just don't have the resources to go after it right now. We're really focused on the server market. But instead, what we got a little bit later was we got the Threadripper series. We got the first generation Threadripper, second generation Threadripper, which is a little bit more challenging. Now we have the third generation Threadripper, which is absolutely awesome. And I actually use the 3970X every single day. But with a third generation Threadripper, there are really like three big features that I think it's missing. The first is that we don't get the full 128 PCIe Gen 4 lanes, so that's kind of not as good as the EPYC side. We also are limited to 4-channel memory instead of EPYC, which is 8-channel memory. And then the last thing that we don't really get is like true ECC memory support. Now you do get ECC UDIMM support, but you're not getting ECC RDIMM support or LRDIMM support or anything like that on the Ryzen Threadripper kind of standard version. And there are a whole bunch of implications on the ECC side and all that support. One of them is the fact that for the professional workstation market, most of those buyers tend to expect that you have ECC memory support and good ECC like RDIMM support. The other big one is just in terms of capacity. If you're using ECC UDIMMs, it's very hard to get to high capacities, over maybe 256 gigabytes in a platform like this. But if you are using RDIMMs, it's pretty easy to get to a half terabyte using 64 gig DIMMs or even more. Back when we had 16 cores, maybe that wasn't as big of a deal, but nowadays when you have things like this processor and you have 64 cores, having more memory actually matters. So in 2020, when the Threadripper PRO was first announced, I immediately called it the WEPYC because to me, this product actually addresses all of those concerns that I had with the original Threadripper or third generation Threadripper series. And it basically makes something that is really a true replacement for those dual Intel Xeon systems that I used to run. Now, we already know a lot about having a 64 core processor from this generation. We know that we have 8 cores per CCD. We have 8 CCDs, which gives us a total of 64 cores. We have 256 megs of level 3 cache. We know all these types of features. We also know that we get DDR4 3200 support. But the platform level changes are absolutely huge in this generation, and that's why I want to take a look at this, which is the Lenovo ThinkStation P620, which is the launch platform and is probably one of the most important platforms in the professional workstation market that you're going to see this year. Now, you might recognize this case because it is a case that Lenovo uses on an Intel Xeon system. I think it's a P520. But what they've basically done is they've taken that Intel Xeon system out and they've installed instead an AMD Threadripper PRO platform. That gives us access to SKUs that range all the way down to 12 cores up to 64 cores. Now, we only have the 64 core version to test, and that's just what it is. There are definitely features of this platform that we see here that we don't really see on normal EPYC server motherboards. For example, we have USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. You'll see some Type-C ports on the front of this chassis as a really good example of where we actually get decent USB connectivity that we don't necessarily get on most EPYC motherboards. Usually on an EPYC motherboard, you might get, say, 2, maybe 3 USB 3 Gen 1 Type A ports. And if you get 3, you're pretty darn lucky. But this is actually designed to be a real workstation. We also have built-in audio, which you typically don't get on a server motherboard. Something else that's really interesting is that we do get Marvell-based 10G-based T. So there's an Aquantia NIC in here. And of course, because this is a professional workstation, we need some legacy I/O. So we have PS2 mouse keyboard port, and we also have USB 2 ports because, well, why not? Now, getting inside the system is super easy. There's a little latch, you pop it open, and you're ready to go. Overall, the Lenovo ThinkStation P620 has an awesome and very easy to service chassis. There's good cable management, and everything is pretty easy to service without tools. You're going to see a 1 kilowatt power supply, which is good, but frankly, with this CPU, which is a 280 watt TDP CPU, and it will use 280 watts, no problem. Plus the fact that you can have 2 double width GPUs and you can get into the higher end NVIDIA Quadro series. In this one, we have the single NVIDIA Quadro RTX 6000, but you could have 2 of those cards. You can also have 2 Quadro 8000 cards. Now we already did a review of a dual Quadro 8000 system, so you can check that out on the STH main site. But this particular system, we only have 1 GPU, but by the time you have a 280 watt CPU, you have 2 big GPUs, you're gonna start wondering if that 1 kilowatt power supply is really enough if you want to go kit out the rest of the system. Still, with this platform, what we get is we get more PCIe lanes than we do on the normal Threadripper system. Plus, we also get a chipset, which we don't necessarily get on the EPYC system. That gives us all the USB functionality that we don't really get on the traditional EPYC platforms, but it does take away a couple of the PCIe lanes to do that. Now we get to the main CPU area. What you're going to see is 8 memory slots along with the CPU socket. Something that I thought was really cool is that Lenovo has this thing right here, which is a custom designed heatsink. And there's actually like 2 fans. There's 2 different parts to this heatsink. Just to even get into it, you have to actually go, and there's little screw holes right here. They have to go and get your screwdriver into to be able to access the mounting points and stuff. So it's actually a pretty cool little design that Lenovo has. And it just looks like a really beefy unit, even to just fit in this size of chassis. The other thing you're going to notice though, is that the CPU socket is flanked by 4 DDR4 DIMM slots on either side. Now, a couple notes on these. The first note is that there are 2 memory coolers, and so there's little fans that sit atop these little airflow guides on each bank of 4 DIMMs. That's just kind of fun because if you see a lot of servers, what they actually do is they have their air baffles not include the memory, and they actually push a lot of air away from the memory. So it's actually kind of interesting that there's like a dedicated, cooler for each bank of 4 DIMMs. It is a cool little design and just a little feature inside. The other one that I thought was just a little bit funny was that this system actually came with a total of 2 16 gigabyte RDIMMs. And so we had effectively a 64 core processor with 128 threads, but only 32 gigabytes of memory. That gives us about a half a gigabyte of memory per core, or about a quarter gigabyte per thread. Normally in our systems, we tend to target somewhere between 4 and 8 gigabytes per core. And so this just kind of seemed like, oh, well, this wasn't that much. So we went to go upgrade the RAM. Just for the heck of it, because we had it in the lab and it was easy because we had it available, we actually had 3DS RDIMMs that were sitting there, and we said, okay, well, let's go try these. They work in EPYC systems. They did not work in this system, so that was just something that we noted, but could have just been the DIMMs that we were using, so that's that. The other one that we did was we actually just put in a total of 8 32 gig DDR4 SK Hynix DIMMs, and they worked perfectly fine, giving us 256 gigs of memory, and it was very easy. Now, performance-wise, we basically know how this is going to perform because this is a 64 core, EPYC derived solution. So, we have the Threadripper 3990X, which gives us that same kind of, almost the same clock speeds. There's a little bit higher actually on that part, but, pretty close to what we have here. We also have tested tons of the 64 core parts on the EPYC side that have the 8-channel memory. So we kind of know what we're going to get. So I know it's pretty hard to see charts and, sitting there and hitting pause and stuff on YouTube to see performance numbers. So what we're going to do is say, if you really want to go look at the performance numbers in detail, go check out the STH main site where we have all the charts and you can see a little bit more. And then on the Linux numbers, we're going to have a little bit broader of a comparison set, both to Threadripper and also to some Xeon systems as well, including the Xeon W3275, because that's obviously going to be a competitor in the single socket space. So what you're going to see on a lot of these charts on the Windows side is that when we compare it to a dual Xeon workstation and a pretty high-end dual Xeon workstation, this chip actually performs pretty well. And really this 64 core part is going directly after the dual socket Intel Xeon market. If you're talking about a lower core count part like a Xeon W3275, that's only a 28 core part. And then you start talking about things like per core licensing, and you don't really necessarily want to have a 64 core part in a workstation like this, you may want to get something more like a 32-core part. But since we don't have the 32-core part for testing, it's really kind of hard to go do that comparison. And in the Linux numbers, what you're going to see is that generally we get performance that's about on par, sometimes a little bit better than the Threadripper 3990X, which is just about what we would expect given similar clock speeds along with the similar architecture. Something I want to take a quick pause on is just in terms of our virtualization results. Now, there is a really good example of where we saw the Threadripper PRO 3995WX perform much better than the Threadripper 3990X. And what you're seeing is that we could scale up to more VMs because we had more memory bandwidth, and that meant that we could keep meeting our SLAs even with more VMs on the processor. That may not seem like a big deal, but when you're doing these kinds of things, it actually is. Now, if you have something that is purely memory bound, then of course you're going to see a big difference going from a 4-channel to an 8-channel solution. But frankly, a lot of workloads, or probably most workloads, are not just memory bound. There's also some compute element and potentially some IO element and other stuff. So the idea that, memory bandwidth is really a component of overall performance, I think is definitely true. You're not going to get 2x of performance on most workloads just because you have 2x of memory channels. But there are definitely limits to this whole memory bandwidth thing. And a really good example of that is that I mentioned earlier that this test system came with two 16 gigabyte DIMMs. And just out of curiosity, we tried the system with those two 16 gig DIMMs, and the performance was actually really bad. And that is a valid configuration from Lenovo that you can buy the system with only two DIMMs in it. But I would certainly tell anyone buying a system, especially if you're going to get something like the 64-core part, do not just have two DIMMs in it. Go get the full 8 because that is a big value prop of the entire system. The other nice thing is just with RDIMM support, getting 32 gig DIMMs or like 32 gig RDIMMs in 2021 are really going to be more or less the smallest capacity. I think in 2020, we didn't even buy anything smaller in RDIMM than a 32 gig RDIMM. And so 2021 is certainly going to be about the smallest that you're going to really see on the server side. And because of that, it's going to be relatively affordable to put into a system like this. And 256 gigs of memory with 64 core CPU is a very good combination. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the specs and we've talked about performance, but what I really want to get into is the market impact of this, because I think that is something that people are really underestimating in terms of the importance of these parts. Now, since we don't have the 32-core Threadripper PRO part, we aren't really going to go do a straight comparison to the Xeon W3275. This is more of a dual socket Xeon competitor. And that is important because with this chip, well, there are some really hard decisions that you're going to have to make. Right now, the value prop of dual Xeons versus something like this comes down to only a couple of factors that are pretty easy to enumerate. If you're running a software package that has a specific Xeon optimization, like say it uses AVX 512 or VNNI or something like that, well, that would be a really good reason to go use a Xeon system over an AMD EPYC system. Likewise, if your ISV only supports Xeons and they don't support AMD right now, well, you're probably not going to go buy an AMD system and not have support for your software. Also, if you are specifically very memory bandwidth bound, having two sockets allows you to get more memory bandwidth per core, which can be important in a lot of applications. And that's a really good reason that some people will still go Intel Xeon over something like this. One of the other reasons that we use that Dell Precision T7920 workstation was we actually bought one of those, and Dimitri uses it to do load generation for our routers. And when I actually got to go check out the system, because I think Bill did the actual review, and I just got to go finally and get my hands on that system, and I thought it was absolutely awesome because one of the things that you can do in that system, for example, is that you can actually use Optane memory. So this is the newer version that's for Cooper Lake and also for upcoming Ice Lake processors. But the PMEM and Optane persistent memory is certainly a big feature that the Intel side has that the AMD side doesn't have at this point. And so if you can use something like these, well, that's a good example of why you might want to get an Intel Xeon system over an AMD system. But the big impact of this chip is not just the performance specs and how well it performs, because it's certainly a great performer. But even though we've had that Threadripper out in the market for a while, if you notice when you go to the Dell, HP, or Lenovo websites up until today, when we are publishing this video, we just checked, and this is the only system that you can go get with Threadripper PRO. Everything else in the market is Xeon at this point. So the big market impact is really, this is a first step in the market for Lenovo. With that said, it's also a little bit strange that Lenovo is the only vendor in market with this system. I mean, Lenovo is a big vendor, but at the same time, I don't necessarily know if they're large enough to be able to support an entire product line like a Threadripper Pro product line just for them. You'd kind of expect that HP and Dell would also want to have systems based on the same design, along with other houses as well. And frankly, Lenovo started selling these systems in September 2020, which is about when they started producing and selling Milan CPUs to large hyperscalers. So I don't necessarily know that this is a difficult CPU for AMD to go build, or this line of CPUs. I think this is actually something that AMD could go and build for its customers. So the fact that Lenovo has an exclusive on this probably means that there's some other, this is part of a broader deal that got them this solution. My guess is that exclusivity will only last for a certain amount of time, and then AMD will eventually open this product up to other vendors. But still, it's a big deal that Lenovo is the only vendor that can deliver this to its customers right now. And at the end of the day, it's a little bit strange if you just kind of take another step back. I mean, this is effectively a processor that AMD built and launched in 2019. This is a rebranded EPYC. And when you take another step back, it's a little bit strange that this is basically a processor that AMD was more or less producing in 2019. It first started selling in late 2020, and then in 2021, we're reviewing this thing and it's still faster in many cases than dual Intel Xeon processors. Now, when Ice Lake launches, hopefully in Q2 of 2021, we're not going to necessarily see this 2-to-1 consolidation like we see on the Intel Xeon scalable, first and second generation compared to this Threadripper Pro chip. We're just not going to see that same level of socket consolidation just because Ice Lake is a huge upgrade compared to Cascade Lake. Even with that, it's a fascinating look at the markets. I mean, AMD clearly has a bigger platform than Intel has at this point by a pretty wide margin, and yet the vast majority of professional workstations are still Intel Xeon based. That really goes to show just how slowly these commercial and the server markets and stuff like that really move, because there is clearly a better product, and AMD's been able to make this product since 2019, and yet we really haven't seen the markets move that fast. And when you compare this to the consumer market, AMD is definitely making inroads much faster. This is an overall fascinating look at markets, because as of the day that we're publishing this video, this Lenovo ThinkStation P620 is the only workstation or professional workstation from Dell, HP, or Lenovo that has this processor right here, which is the AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro series. You would think, just based on specs, that AMD would have a lot more market share, but really they only have one system, which really limits their market share. Overall, Lenovo and AMD did a great job on this system. William is going to have a review of the full system on the STH main site soon, but we wanted to go and pull out and really talk about the processor separate from the system, because I think those are two distinct stories that we wanted to tell. And if we're being completely honest here, this is not a brand new groundbreaking platform. I mean, AMD already basically had all of the components that it needed for something like this. It just needed to go put it together and package it in this Threadripper Pro series. I still think it should be called a WEPYC, but Threadripper Pro it is. And just the fact that AMD is making these inroads into systems like this from Lenovo is a big deal in the space. As someone who used dual Intel Xeon systems for absolutely years, this is the exact platform that I wanted in 2017. I just kind of hoped that I would have had it in 2019 and I wouldn't be reviewing it in 2021, but that's what it is. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at the AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 3995WX processor and the Lenovo ThinkStation P620. Now we're going to have a review on the main site of the processor and also the system. The processor will go live with this video, but just something that I want to keep you abreast of. And if you do have questions about the Lenovo ThinkStation P620, the processor, anything like that that you want us to cover in the review of the system itself, the workstation itself, let us know. We can just put something in the comments and hopefully we can address that when we get there. And hey, if you made it this far and you like this video, well, what you could do to help us is actually give us a like, click subscribe, turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.